How does a man sworn to heal learn to kill? In the blistering sun of the year 1190, amid the stench of blood and disease that hung over the besieged city of Acre, this was not a philosophical question. It was a practical one. It was a choice made every single hour in a makeshift hospital founded by merchants from Lübeck and Bremen, a place of supposed mercy in the very heart of hell. They called themselves the Brotherhood of the German House of St. Mary in Jerusalem, and their first duty was to the sick and the dying. They were healers, philanthropists, men of God who had come to the Holy Land to soothe the wounds of Christendom. But outside their tents the world was screaming, the crusade was failing, the Saracen scimitars were relentless, and faith alone could not turn a blade. What is more frightening, an enemy who wants to kill you, or a brother in faith who forces you to kill in the name of God? This was the dilemma born in the crucible of Acre. The wounded they tended to were knights, soldiers, men whose entire purpose was violence, and the line between tending to the warrior and becoming the warrior began to blur. It was a simple, brutal calculus. A dead knight cannot fight. A healed knight can. But what if there are not enough knights left? What if the hands that bind wounds must also be the hands that inflict them? The transformation was not instantaneous. It was a slow poison, a necessary evil that became a sacred duty. In the year 1198, Pope Celestine III issued the bull that changed everything. He recognized them not just as a hospitaller order, but as a military one. They were granted the white mantle, emblazoned with a stark black cross. They were given the right to wield the sword, to wage war, to kill in the name of the very God who commanded, "Thou shalt not kill." It was a paradox wrapped in piety, a holy license for slaughter. The first Grand Master, Heinrich Walpott von Bassenheim, must have wrestled with this. His brothers, who had come to the East to follow Christ's example of compassion, were now being asked to follow the bloody path of conquest. They were to be both monks and soldiers, their days split between the solemn prayers of the chapel and the brutal, visceral work of the battlefield. They adopted the fierce rule of the Templars for their military life and the compassionate rule of the Hospitallers for their charitable work. They were attempting to serve two masters, one of peace and one of war, convinced they could reconcile the two. It was a noble and ultimately doomed ambition. They came to heal bodies, but stayed to maim souls and called it a holy mission. The crucible of Acre forged them into something new, something hard and unforgiving. They fought with the desperate fury of men who believed their cause was righteous. They learned the grim arithmetic of siege warfare, the terror of a cavalry charge, the cold satisfaction of a successful defense. They saw their brothers fall, not to sickness in a quiet ward, but with arrows in their throats and swords in their bellies. This baptism of fire burned away their initial innocence. They saw the political maneuvering of the other, older orders, the wealthy Templars, the powerful Hospitallers, and they learned that piety without power was a form of suicide in the treacherous landscape of the Crusader states. They were the newcomers, the German upstarts, and they had to be harder, more disciplined, more ruthless than their rivals to survive. They were no longer just tending to the consequences of war, they were becoming its instruments. Could you remain human when your whole world demands you become a monster? The knights of the Teutonic Order would spend the next several centuries answering that question, and their answer would be written in blood across the map of Europe. Their world was one of brutal contrasts. In the morning, a knight might stand in the infirmary, his hands gently cleaning a festering wound, whispering prayers for a fallen comrade's soul. By the afternoon, those same hands would be gripping the hilt of a sword, slick with the blood of an enemy he had just cut down. They believed they were purifying the world, but the filth of their work clung to them. The psychological toll must have been immense, a constant tension between the monk's vow of humility and the knight's pride, between the healer's compassion and the soldier's necessary cruelty. This internal conflict defined their early years. They were striving for a state of grace while engaging in the most graceless of acts. Their black cross was not merely a symbol of Christ's sacrifice, it became a target, a banner of holy war that invited as much hatred as it inspired devotion. They were learning that the sword was a hungry god, and it demanded constant sacrifice. Every victory, every piece of land gained, only deepened their commitment to violence as the ultimate solution. The city of Acre was a microcosm of their future. It was a place of immense wealth and desperate poverty, of sublime faith and base treachery. For the Teutonic Knights, it was a school of survival. They learned to navigate the labyrinthine politics of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, playing rival factions against each other. They learned to fortify castles, to manage supply lines, to levy taxes. They were becoming more than just soldiers, they were becoming administrators of conflict. Their grandmaster was not just a general, but a chief executive officer of a burgeoning enterprise, one whose primary business was war. The hospital, their original reason for being, slowly became secondary to the barracks. The resources, the manpower, the very soul of the order were being redirected from saving lives to taking them. It was a subtle shift, one that likely went unnoticed by many of the brothers themselves, who were caught up in the daily struggle for survival and the intoxicating rhetoric of the Holy Crusade. They believed they were God's chosen instruments, but they were being reforged in a furnace of human ambition and political necessity. The fall of Acre in the year 1291 was the cataclysm that ended this chapter and began the next. It was an apocalypse. The last Christian bastion in the Holy Land was overrun by the Mamluk Sultanate in a storm of fire and blood. The Teutonic Knights fought with suicidal bravery, their white mantles stained red. They defended their castle, their headquarters, to the last man. But it was not enough. The dream of a Christian Jerusalem was dead, drowned in the Mediterranean Sea, along with the thousands of refugees who tried to flee the burning city. For the order, it was a total, crushing defeat. They had lost their home, their purpose, their very reason for existing. They were now a military order without a war to fight, a hospital, a brotherhood with no hospital to run in the land of its birth. They were exiles forced to retreat to their holdings in Europe, primarily to their new headquarters in Venice. They were a sword without a sheath, a powerful, disciplined, and now homeless weapon. An organization forged in the crucible of holy war, with no holy war left to wage. This was the most dangerous moment in their history. An army of fanatics with no enemy is a threat only to itself, or to the first person who offers them a new one. This exodus from the Holy Land could have been their end. Many believed it would be. The Templars, their great rivals, would soon be destroyed by the King of France, accused of heresy and greed. The Teutonic Order was just as vulnerable. They were wealthy, arrogant, and now seemingly obsolete. What use was a crusading order when the crusade was over? The Grand Master of the time, Conrad von Feuchtwangen, understood this existential threat. The order could not survive as a relic. It needed a new mission, a new frontier, a new enemy to justify its existence, its wealth, and its formidable military power. It needed a new crusade. The taste of power, once acquired, is not easily surrendered. They had built an efficient, ruthless machine for conquest and administration. To simply let that machine rust away was unthinkable. It had to be pointed at something. It had to be unleashed. The brothers, trained for a lifetime of war, were not prepared to beat their swords into plowshares. The black cross on their backs was not a symbol of martyrdom. It was a promise of war. And they were desperate to find someone, somewhere, to keep that promise too. The search for a new purpose became an obsession. They looked around Europe, a continent of established kingdoms and shifting alliances. There were no more holy lands to conquer, only Christian neighbors to quarrel with. This was the moment their identity shifted definitively. They were no longer defenders of a distant kingdom. They were now a freelance army of God, a corporation of holy warriors for hire, looking for a new market. Their reputation preceded them. They were disciplined, effective, and utterly ruthless. And it was this reputation that brought them to the attention of a beleaguered monarch in the wild, untamed east of Europe. A king with a pagan problem on his borders, a king who needed an army that would not flinch at the brutal work that needed to be done. He didn't know it yet, but in inviting the Teutonic knights into his lands, he was not hiring guards. He was inviting wolves to watch over his sheep. The Order was about to get its new war, and it would be a dress rehearsal for the creation of its own terrifying kingdom. They had learned their trade in the deserts of Judea, but they would perfect it in the dark forests of Eastern Europe. The loss of Acre had taught them a bitter lesson. Never again would they fight for a kingdom that was not their own. Never again would they spill their blood to defend the lands of a weak and vacillating foreign king. Their survival depended on having their own sovereign territory, a state forged by their own swords and ruled by their own Grand Master. The dream was no longer to serve a kingdom, but to become one. This ambition, born from the ashes of their defeat in the Holy Land, would drive them for the next 2 centuries. It transformed them from crusaders into conquerors, from defenders of the faith into architects of a new kind of empire. They were no longer content to be a piece on the chessboard of European politics. They intended to become the hand that moved the pieces. Their new home would not be a gift, it would be taken. And the price would be paid by whoever was unfortunate enough to be living there when they arrived. Their time in the East was over, but their story of blood and iron was just beginning. The first taste of this new strategy would come in the mountainous, rugged lands of Transylvania. This opportunity arose in the year 1211. An invitation arrived from Andrew II, the King of Hungary. He was a man with a problem. His southeastern border, a wild and mountainous region known as the Burzenland, was being terrorized by nomadic warriors, the Cumans. They were pagans, fierce horsemen who swept out of the plains to raid and pillage his Christian subjects. King Andrew needed a buffer, a permanent military presence to hold the line. He needed specialists in the art of war against the infidel, and who better for the job than the landless, battle-hardened veterans of the Holy Land, the Teutonic Knights. He offered them land, tax exemptions, and significant autonomy in exchange for securing his frontier. It seemed like a perfect deal for everyone involved. The king would get his border secured, and the Order would get a new home, a new purpose. It was a fatal miscalculation. Andrew thought he was hiring soldiers. In reality, he was seeding his kingdom with the dragon's teeth of a rival power. The lessons of Transylvania would be harsh, bloody, and they would shape the destiny of the Order for centuries to come. What do you believe motivated the knights more, their sacred vow to defend Christendom, or their human ambition for a kingdom of their own? Tell us in the comments what you think drove these holy assassins. King Andrew II of Hungary had invited the Teutonic Knights to guard his frontier, but the Order had grander plans than simply being border guards. They arrived in Transylvania not as humble servants, but as masters-in-waiting. Led by a shrewd and ambitious commander, they immediately set about transforming the Burzenland into their own personal fiefdom. The terms of the agreement were generous, but the knights interpreted them with a calculated audacity. They didn't just build forts, they constructed 5 formidable stone castles: Marienburg, Schwarzenberg, Rosenau, Kreuzberg, and Kronstadt, which were less defensive outposts and more anchors of a new independent state. These were not mere watchtowers, they were centers of administration, commerce, and military power designed to project authority, not just repel raiders. They weren't there to serve the Hungarian crown, they were there to replace it. The local Hungarian and Saxon nobility watched with growing alarm as the white-mantled knights systematically consolidated their power, treating the king's grant of land as the foundation of their own sovereign nation. The Cumans were the pretext, but the land itself was the prize. The war against the Cumans was prosecuted with the Order's characteristic efficiency and brutality. They did not just defend, they attacked. Their heavy cavalry, a force of nature honed in the wars of the Levant, smashed the light horsemen of the plains. They launched punitive raids deep into Cuman territory, burning encampments, seizing livestock, and carrying off captives. They secured the mountain passes and pacified the region in a remarkably short time, but their success only fueled their ambition. They encouraged German peasants and artisans, the Saxons of Transylvania, to settle the land, creating a loyal population that owed its allegiance not to the distant Hungarian king, but to the order that protected them and gave them land. They built towns, established markets, and even began minting their own coins. They were creating a state within a state, a German-speaking Catholic entity on the edge of Orthodox and pagan lands, ruled with an iron fist from their castle commanderies. King Andrew had wanted a shield. He had gotten a dagger pointed at his own back. In Hungary, they learned a vital lesson. A borrowed kingdom is just a gilded cage. The breaking point came in the year 1224. The Grand Master of the Order, the brilliant and arrogant Hermann von Salza, made a move of astonishing boldness. He went directly to Pope Honorius III and had the Order's lands in Transylvania declared a direct fief of the papacy. With this single political maneuver, he attempted to cut the King of Hungary out of the equation entirely. The Burzenland would no longer be part of Hungary. It would be a papal state administered by the Teutonic Knights. It was a declaration of independence, a calculated act of betrayal. For King Andrew II, this was the final, unforgivable insult. He had invited these men into his kingdom, given them land and privilege, and they had repaid him by trying to steal a piece of his realm from under his nose. His patience, already worn thin by their arrogance and land-grabbing, finally snapped. The lesson he was about to teach the Order would be as brutal as any they had delivered to the Cumans. The royal wrath was swift and decisive. In the year 1225, King Andrew assembled a massive army and marched on the Burzenland. The knights, for all their military prowess, were vastly outnumbered. They had alienated the local nobility and could expect no help from them. They were isolated, surrounded, and facing the full might of a kingdom they had betrayed. The Hungarian army swept through their lands, laying siege to their formidable castles. The fighting was fierce, but the outcome was never in doubt. The Order was systematically and forcibly expelled from the kingdom. They were driven out of the very fortresses they had built, stripped of the lands they had colonized, and cast out of the home they had so confidently carved out for themselves. It was a humiliating, catastrophic failure. They left Transylvania with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a burning sense of resentment. But they also left with something far more valuable, an education. They had made a critical mistake. They had tried to build their state on land that already belonged to a powerful Christian king. They would not make that mistake again. The Transylvanian rehearsal, as it came to be known, was a formative experience. It taught them several crucial lessons that would define their future conquests. First, trust no Christian prince. Alliances were temporary. The hunger for land was eternal. Second, autonomy was not enough. They needed absolute sovereignty, a land where the Grand Master's word was the only law. Third, and most importantly, their state must be built on land taken not from a fellow Christian, but from the heathen. A war against pagans could be justified as a holy crusade, a mission from God himself. Any lands taken in such a war would be theirs by right of conquest and divine mandate. No king, no emperor, and not even the Pope himself could dispute a claim sanctified by the blood of the infidel. The expulsion from Hungary was not an end, but a refinement of their strategy. It hardened their resolve and clarified their vision. They now knew exactly what they were looking for, a land of pagans, politically fragmented and strategically located, where they could unleash their war machine and finally build their long-dreamed-of Ordensstaat, their state of the Order. This new opportunity did not take long to appear. As the knights licked their wounds and regrouped in their German holdings, another plea for help arrived from the wild eastern frontier. This time it came from Conrad I, the Duke of Mazovia, a Polish princeling whose lands were being ravaged by raids from the north. His enemies were the Prussians, a collection of fierce pagan Baltic tribes who inhabited the dense forests and marshlands along the Baltic coast. They were a people who worshipped nature gods in sacred groves, who practiced polygamy, and who fiercely resisted any attempts at Christianization. For decades, Polish dukes and Cistercian monks had tried and failed to subdue them. Now Conrad was desperate. He offered the Teutonic Knights the Chełmno land, a territory on the border of Prussia, as a base of operations in exchange for their help in protecting his duchy and converting the pagans. It was Transylvania all over again, but with one crucial difference. The Prussians had no powerful king, no centralized state. They were a people, not a kingdom, and they were pagans. It was the perfect scenario. The Grand Master, Hermann von Salza, was a master diplomat. He was not about to repeat the mistakes of Hungary. Before accepting Conrad's offer, he secured his position with unimpeachable legal authority. He went to the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, a man he served as a trusted advisor. In the year 1226, Frederick issued the Golden Bull of Rimini. This document was a masterpiece of political maneuvering. It granted the Teutonic Order not just the Chełmno land, but any and all territories they could conquer from the Prussians. It declared that these conquered lands would be held by the Order as a sovereign principality under the direct authority of the Emperor and the Pope alone forever. They would be beholden to no Polish duke, no local prince. They would be masters of all they surveyed. This bull was their license to conquer, their legal foundation for the creation of a sovereign state. It was the blank check they had been dreaming of. With the emperor's blessing secured, Hermann von Salza then turned to the Pope, Gregory IX, who in 1234 issued the Golden Bull of Rieti, confirming the emperor's grant and placing the future conquests under the protection of the Holy See. The legal and religious framework was now complete. The order had the blessing of the two most powerful men in Christendom. Their impending war against the Prussians was not to be a mere border dispute. It was officially sanctioned as a holy crusade, with all the spiritual rewards and worldly justifications that entailed. Any man who fought and died in this war was promised remission of his sins. The knights were no longer just soldiers, they were agents of God's will, and the conquest of Prussia was their sacred destiny. The stage was set for one of the longest, most brutal, and most systematic campaigns of conquest in European history. The 70-year war that followed would not be a war of armies, it would be the deliberate, programmatic extermination of a people and their culture. The first knights arrived on the banks of the Vistula River in the year 1230. They were a small vanguard, but they brought with them the accumulated knowledge of a century of warfare. Their strategy was methodical and relentless. First, they would build a castle, a wooden and then stone fortress on a strategic riverbank or hilltop. This castle, or burg, would serve as a secure base of operations. From this fortress, they would launch raids into the surrounding countryside, burning villages, destroying crops, and killing or enslaving the local population. They would terrorize the region, systematically depopulating it and breaking the will of the native Prussians to resist. This provoked the very raids they were ostensibly there to prevent, which in turn justified ever more brutal retaliation. It was a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle of violence. The Prussians, who fought as decentralized tribal warriors, were no match for the disciplined, heavily armored knights and their organized military machine. The conquest of Prussia was a grim, bloody affair that stretched for more than 5 decades. It was a war of annihilation. The Order's strategy was not simply to defeat the Prussian warriors in battle, but to erase their entire civilization. When a region was pacified, the knights would build another castle further into the wilderness, repeating the process, inch by bloody inch. They systematically destroyed the sacred groves of the Prussians, felling the ancient oaks and building chapels on the desecrated ground. They outlawed the Prussian language, their customs, their religion. To be a Prussian was to be an enemy of Christ, and the only choices offered were baptism, enslavement, or death. and for many baptism was little more than a prelude to a life of serfdom under their new German masters. The land was being cleansed, scoured of its original inhabitants, to make way for German settlers who were invited in to farm the newly conquered territories. The knights did not conquer Prussia, they erased it and wrote their own name on the vacant parchment. The foundation of their state was not stone, but the bones of a murdered people. The Prussian resistance was fierce, desperate, and ultimately hopeless. There were two major uprisings, massive rebellions that saw the tribes unite in a last doomed effort to throw off the German yoke. The first, from 1242 to 1249, and the second, the Great Prussian Uprising, from 1260 to 1274, were wars of incredible savagery on both sides. Led by charismatic chieftains like Hircus Monte, a Prussian who had been educated in Germany and understood the Order's tactics, the rebels managed to destroy castles and ambush knightly columns, winning several stunning victories. But they could not win the war. The Order had the institutional depth and the logistical support of all of Catholic Europe. When they suffered losses, new recruits, crusading guest knights from Germany and beyond, would arrive to fill the ranks, eager for adventure and the promise of salvation. The Prussians had only themselves. The uprisings were crushed with unimaginable cruelty. Entire tribes were wiped out, their populations massacred or sold into slavery. By the end of the 13th century, the conquest was complete. The Prussian people, as a distinct cultural and political entity, had ceased to exist. On this land, drenched in the blood of its native inhabitants, the Teutonic Knights would now build their perfect state, a monument to the terrifying power of faith and steel. The conquest of Prussia was complete. The forests that had once echoed with prayers to Pecunus, the god of thunder, now fell silent or echoed with the clang of German axes and the Latin chants of the warrior monks. The land was theirs, won by the sword and sanctified by the church. Now came the true challenge to govern it. The Order did not merely occupy Prussia, they remade it in their own image. They created a state, the Ordensstaat, that was arguably the most efficient, centralized and totalitarian system in all of medieval Europe. It was a state run like a military monastery, a corporation whose sole shareholders were God and the Grand Master. Its capital was not just a city, but a symbol, a fortress of such immense scale and power that it seemed to be a physical manifestation of the Order's own cold, unyielding ambition. This fortress, built on the banks of the Nogat River, was called Marienburg, Mary's Castle. It would become the heart and brain of a vast, disciplined machine of control and exploitation. Its red brick walls rose like a challenge to heaven itself, a declaration that here, on this conquered land, the Order's will was absolute. The structure of the Ordensstaat was a pyramid of rigid, military-style command. At the apex was the Grand Master, an elected monarch with near-absolute power. Below him were the 5 Grand Commanders, the Grand Commander, the Marshal, the Hospitaller, the Treasurer, and the Trappier, in charge of clothing and equipment, who formed his council. The entire territory was divided into districts called commanderies, or Komtureien, each ruled from a fortified castle by a commander, the Komtur. These commanders were the regional governors, judges, and military leaders responsible for every aspect of life in their domain. They oversaw tax collection, administered justice, and maintained the garrison of knight brothers and locally recruited soldiers. This network of castles, each a day's ride from the next, formed the steel skeleton of the state, ensuring that no corner of the land was ever far from the Order's watchful eye and heavy hand. Life within this system was one of absolute obedience. For the knight brothers themselves, the rule was strict: poverty, chastity, and obedience. Their lives were a relentless cycle of prayer, military drills, and administrative duties. There was no room for dissent, no space for individuality. They were cogs in a holy machine. The economy of the Ordensstaat was as ruthlessly efficient as its military. The order established a monopoly on the lucrative trade in amber, the Baltic gold, and, more importantly, on the buying and selling of grain. They owned vast agricultural estates, or granji, which were worked by the subjugated remnants of the Prussian population, who were now little more than serfs, bound to the land. German colonists were encouraged to immigrate, granted land in exchange for taxes and military service. They founded over 1,000 new villages and nearly 100 new towns, including major centers like Königsberg, Elbing, and Thorn. These towns were granted charters based on German law, but they too were under the firm control of the order. The state controlled the mills, the fisheries, the ferries. All commerce flowed through channels directed by and for the benefit of the order. The wealth generated by this system was staggering, and it was all funneled back to Marienburg to fund the order's endless wars and its ever-expanding administrative apparatus. This was not feudalism as it was known in the rest of Europe, with its complex web of loyalties and obligations. This was something new, a centralized corporate state dedicated to the singular goal of self-perpetuation and expansion. Marienburg itself was the ultimate expression of this power. It was the largest brick castle in the world, a colossal complex of outer bailies, middle and high castles, towering walls and deep moats. It was a fortress, a monastery, and a palace all in one. Its grand refectories could seat hundreds of knights. Its soaring chapel was a masterpiece of Gothic architecture. But beneath the beauty and the piety lay a darker reality. Marienburg was the administrative hub of a police state. Its archives contained detailed records on every village, every mill, every tax payment. Its dungeons held political prisoners, rebellious Prussian nobles, and brothers accused of breaking their vows. An intricate network of spies and informants, the so-called Kumpane, ensured that any hint of rebellion or dissent was swiftly reported and brutally crushed. The Grand Master ruled from this fortress like a spider at the center of a vast web. The bureaucracy of death and conquest had been perfected into a science of governance. Life for the common man in the Ordenstadt was predictable, orderly, and safe from outside attack. But it was a life without freedom, under the constant, unblinking gaze of the Black Cross. What was it like to be a knight in this system? For a young German nobleman who joined the order, it was a life of immense privilege and extreme sacrifice. He would surrender his personal wealth, his family ties, and his right to marry. In return, he became part of an elite brotherhood, a member of the ruling class of a powerful and wealthy state. His days were governed by the bell, prayers at dawn, weapons training in the castle yard, perhaps inspecting a new mill or presiding over a local court. He would eat his meals in silence in the great refectory, listening to a reading from the Bible. He fought in the summer campaigns against the neighboring pagans, a brutal but glorious business that promised him a place in heaven. But it was also a life of profound loneliness and psychological pressure. The order was his only family. The Grand Master was his only father. Any deviation from the strict code of conduct could result in harsh punishment, fasting, flogging, or imprisonment in the dark. It bred a peculiar kind of man, pious, disciplined, and often arrogant, but also capable of incredible cruelty, convinced that any action, no matter how brutal, was justified in the service of the order's divine mission. The state that the Teutonic Knights built was a paradox. It was a beacon of German civilization and Catholic faith on a wild frontier. Its cities were models of planning, its agriculture was advanced, its administration was, for the time, remarkably efficient. They brought German law, German language, and German technology to a region they considered backward and savage. But this entire edifice of order and progress was built upon a foundation of genocide and maintained by a system of total control. The native Prussians were a broken people, their culture shattered, their spirit crushed. They lived as second-class citizens in their own homeland, a silent, sullen presence in the fields and forests. The German settlers, while enjoying more freedom, were still subjects of an absolute theocratic military dictatorship. The order had succeeded. They had built their perfect state, their sovereign kingdom won by the sword. But a state born of such violence is inherently unstable. It needs an enemy. It requires a permanent state of war to justify its existence, to keep its warrior class occupied, and to feed its insatiable appetite for land and glory. Having exterminated the Prussians, the order now turned its gaze eastward to the last great pagan power in Europe. This new enemy was the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The war against Lithuania would be different. Unlike the fragmented Prussian tribes, the Lithuanians were a rising power, a formidable and unified state under a series of brilliant rulers. This conflict would not be a swift conquest, but a grinding 200-year struggle, a perpetual crusade that became the central organizing principle of the Teutonic Order's existence. The justification was simple. The Lithuanians were the last pagans in Europe, a defiant bastion of the old gods in a continent that had bowed to the cross. For the Order, this was a godsend. The war against Lithuania provided them with a permanent theological and ideological reason to be. It was their raison d'être, the fuel that powered their military machine and the magnet that drew crusading knights from all over Europe, from England, France, Bohemia and beyond, to come to Prussia and participate in the Holy War. These guests came for adventure, for glory, and for the plenary indulgence promised by the Pope for fighting the heathen. These campaigns, known as the Reisen, became a kind of brutal, ritualized sport for the European aristocracy. This eternal war transformed the border between the Ordenstaat and Lithuania into a desolate, blood-soaked wilderness. For 2 centuries, this frontier was the scene of almost constant raiding and counter-raiding. In the summer and winter, when the swamps and rivers were frozen solid, the Order would launch its expeditions. A column of knights, their white mantles brilliant against the snow, accompanied by their guests and a host of native conscripts, would sweep into Lithuanian territory. They would burn villages, slaughter the inhabitants, and carry off thousands into slavery. The goal was not to conquer and hold territory in the same way they had in Prussia, but to terrorize and depopulate the borderlands, creating a barren wasteland, a no-man's land that would serve as a defensive buffer. The Lithuanians, led by warrior princes like Gediminas and Kęstutis, responded in kind. Their light cavalry would stage lightning raids into Prussia, leaving a trail of devastation, burning German settlements and freeing Prussian slaves. It was a war of mutual atrocities, a cycle of hatred that spanned generations. There was no glory here, only suffering. Could a state built on such perpetual, grinding cruelty truly call itself holy? Or was it just a machine that needed blood to keep its gears from rusting? We'll let you be the judge. Tell us, would you prefer the orderly tyranny of the Order's state, or the chaotic freedom of the lands it sought to conquer? Share your choice and your reason in the comments below. The long war with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was more than a military conflict. It was the defining cultural and spiritual activity of the Teutonic Order. It was a holy mission that had devolved into a grim, seasonal ritual. Twice a year, in the winter and the summer, the Marshal of the Order would lead the army on a rise, an expedition into the Lithuanian wilderness. These were not wars of conquest in the Prussian style. They were massive, destructive raids designed to inflict maximum economic and psychological damage. For the European nobility, participating in one of these Reisen became a fashionable, almost mandatory adventure. It was a chance to win glory, to fulfill a crusading vow without the expense and danger of a journey to the Holy Land, and to witness the raw, brutal reality of holy war. Knights from England, France, Burgundy, and all across the Holy Roman Empire flocked to Marienburg. They were feasted by the Grand Master, equipped for the campaign, and then led into the dark forests to hunt, not beasts, but men. It was a deadly form of tourism, a medieval safari where the prey was the last pagan people of Europe. The nature of this warfare was uniquely savage. The objective was rarely to capture and hold a fortress, but to cause terror. The chronicles of the time, written by the Order's own scribes like Peter of Duisburg, speak with chilling frankness of the burning of villages, the massacre of non-combatants, and the systematic destruction of the Lithuanian heartland. The knights and their guests would sweep through a district, leaving nothing but ashes and corpses in their wake. Captives, if they were not killed outright, were herded back to Prussia to be sold as slaves or forcibly resettled as serfs. The Lithuanians, of course, were not passive victims. They were a formidable military power, and their own raids into Prussia were conducted with equal ferocity. They perfected the art of the ambush, luring columns of heavily armored knights into dense forests or treacherous swamps where their tactical advantages were nullified. For every village burned in Lithuania, a German settlement in Prussia would be put to the torch in revenge. It was a war without fronts, without decisive battles, a grinding war of attrition that bled both sides for 2 centuries. This perpetual conflict had a profound effect on the Order itself. It kept their martial skills sharp and their military purpose clear. But it also institutionalized a level of cruelty that was shocking even by medieval standards. The constant dehumanization of the enemy, the routine slaughter of women and children, the business of slave raiding, all of this coarsened the spiritual life of the warrior monks. They had been founded to protect pilgrims and heal the sick. Now their primary function was to inflict misery on an industrial scale. The war became an end in itself, a self-justifying enterprise. The vast revenues of the Ordensstaat were poured into maintaining the military machine needed for the Reisen, and the Reisen, in turn, justified the existence of the state and its oppressive economic system. It was a perfect closed loop of violence and profit. War had become their business, and business was good. Any act of violence could be justified, any atrocity excused, because the enemy was a pagan, an enemy of God. But what happens when the enemy ceases to be a pagan? The turning point, the event that fatally undermined the Order's entire ideological foundation, came in the year 1386. In a masterstroke of diplomacy, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Jogaila, agreed to convert to Christianity. He married the young Queen of Poland, Jadwiga, was baptized, and became King Władysław II Jagiełła of Poland. In a single stroke, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the Order's eternal pagan enemy, had become a Christian kingdom, dynastically united with their old rival, Poland. This was a political and ideological catastrophe for the Teutonic Knights. Their holy war was suddenly rendered obsolete. Their entire reason for being, the justification for their state, their wealth, and their endless wars, had vanished overnight. They were now surrounded not by pagans and schismatics, but by 2 powerful, united, and hostile Christian kingdoms. Their mission was over. But an organization like the Order could not simply stop. They had too much power, too much wealth, and too much pride to simply fade away. So they did the only thing they knew how to do. They lied. The Order's propagandists went into overdrive. They refused to recognize the conversion of Jogaila and the Lithuanians as genuine. They denounced them as false Christians, as pagans who had only adopted the faith for political gain while secretly continuing to worship their old gods. They petitioned the Pope. They sent envoys to the courts of Europe, desperately trying to keep the fiction of the pagan threat alive. For a time it worked. The Reisen continued, though now they were simply unprovoked attacks on a fellow Christian state, stripped of any religious justification. But the political landscape of Europe had fundamentally shifted. The union of Poland and Lithuania had created a superpower on the Order's borders, a power that now had a legitimate grievance and the military might to act on it. The knights, blinded by a century of arrogance and easy victories, failed to recognize the mortal danger they were in. They continued their raids, continued their political provocations, and continued to treat Poland-Lithuania with contempt. They were sowing the wind, and they were about to reap the whirlwind. The stage was being set for a final, apocalyptic confrontation, a battle that would decide the fate of Eastern Europe for centuries to come. The hubris of the Order reached its peak under Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen. He was a proud, aggressive, and fatally overconfident leader who believed in the invincibility of his knights. He saw the Polish-Lithuanian alliance not as a threat to be managed, but as an obstacle to be smashed. The simmering tensions finally boiled over into open war in the year 1409. The following summer, in 1410, King Jogaila of Poland and his cousin, the Grand Duke Vytautas of Lithuania, amassed a colossal army, the largest ever seen in that part of Europe. Polish knights, Lithuanian boyars, Russian contingents from Smolensk, and even a large force of Tatar horsemen, all traditional enemies, marched together under one banner with a single purpose: to break the power of the Teutonic Order once and for all. They crossed the border and marched deep into the heart of Prussia, directly towards the capital at Marienburg. Ulrich von Jungingen, eager for a decisive battle, gathered every available knight and mercenary and marched out to meet them. The two armies met on the 15th of July 1410 on a vast rolling plain between the villages of Tannenberg and Grunwald. It was to be one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the entire Middle Ages. The Order's army was smaller but better equipped and composed of the most feared heavy cavalry in the world. They were a seemingly unstoppable force of disciplined, steel-clad professionals. On the other side was a vast, multi-ethnic host, united only by their common hatred of the Order. As the sun climbed high in the sky, the two armies stood facing each other. The tension was unbearable. According to the chronicler Jan Długosz, Grand Master von Jungingen, impatient for the battle to begin, sent two swords to King Jogaila and Grand Duke Vytautas as a chivalric challenge, an arrogant gesture he would soon regret. The battle that followed would not be a chivalrous affair. It would be a slaughter. A day of reckoning was at hand, and the myth of Teutonic invincibility was about to be shattered in a storm of steel and blood. The Battle of Grunwald began with a thunderous charge of the Lithuanian cavalry under Grand Duke Vytautas against the Order's left flank. The initial clash was ferocious, a chaotic maelstrom of men and horses. The Lithuanians, after a fierce struggle, appeared to break and flee. Seeing this, the knights on that flank, believing victory was at hand, broke formation and gave chase in a disorganized pursuit. It was a classic and fatal trap. The flight was a feigned retreat, a tactic perfected by the horsemen of the steppes. As the knights were drawn away from the main body of their army, the Lithuanians turned and enveloped them, while the main Polish force, held in reserve by the cautious King Jogaila, smashed into the now exposed and disordered center of the Order's line. At the same time, Polish peasants hidden in the nearby woods emerged to attack the Order's camp. The battle descended into a brutal, chaotic melee. The disciplined formations of the knights collapsed into a series of desperate individual struggles for survival. The turning point came when Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen, seeing his army on the verge of collapse, gathered his last reserves, 16 banners of elite knights, and led a desperate suicidal charge directly at the Polish command center, hoping to kill King Jogaila himself. For a moment, it seemed he might succeed. He broke through the Polish lines and came within sight of the king, but the Polish royal guard held firm. The charge was halted, and in the swirling chaos, Ulrich von Jungingen was surrounded, pulled from his horse, and killed. His death signaled the end. With their leader gone, the remaining knights lost all cohesion. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. Surrounded and overwhelmed, the knights were cut down by the hundreds. Their pride, their discipline, their heavy armor, none of it could save them. The entire high command of the Order, including the Grand Master, the Grand Marshal, and hundreds of the most experienced knight commanders, lay dead on the field. It was an annihilation, the collapse of an empire in a single, bloody afternoon. The aftermath of the battle was a scene of apocalyptic horror. The fields of Grunwald were littered with thousands of corpses, the white mantles of the dead knights stark against the blood-soaked earth. The victors spent days identifying the bodies of the Order's leadership. The body of the Grand Master was found, and King Jogaila, in a gesture of magnanimity, ordered it to be treated with respect and sent back to Marienburg for burial. The losses for the order were catastrophic, almost unimaginable. They had lost not just an army, but an entire generation of its leaders and warriors. The myth of their invincibility was shattered forever. The news of the defeat spread like wildfire across Europe, sending shockwaves of disbelief. The invincible holy warriors had been crushed. In the immediate aftermath, the victorious Polish-Lithuanian army marched on the undefended capital of Marienburg. The fortress, the symbol of the Order's power, seemed doomed. It was besieged, and its fall would have meant the complete and utter destruction of the Teutonic state. But in this moment of ultimate crisis, the Order found an unlikely savior. The fortress held. The new Grand Master, Heinrich von Plauen, organized a desperate and heroic defense, and the Polish-Lithuanian army, plagued by dysentery and logistical problems, eventually had to lift the siege and withdraw. Marienburg was saved, but the mortal blow had been struck. The Order would survive, but it would never be the same. It was now a broken, humbled power, and its long, painful agony had just begun. The defeat at Grunwald was a wound from which the Teutonic Order would never truly recover. They had not only lost their army and their leadership, but also their aura of divine favor. The financial cost of the defeat was staggering. The Peace of Thorn in 1411 forced the Order to pay a massive indemnity to the Kingdom of Poland, an amount so large it bankrupted their treasury. To raise the money, they had to melt down church silver, levy crushing taxes on their cities and lands, and plunge the state deep into debt. This economic crisis triggered a political one. The Prussian cities of the Hanseatic League, Danzig, Thorn, Elbing, and the landed gentry had long resented the Order's autocratic rule and its monopolistic economic policies. Now, weakened and humiliated, the Order's authority began to crumble from within. The subjects of the Ordenstaat, who had borne the heavy cost of the Knights' ambitions for generations, began to question why they should continue to sacrifice for a ruling class that had proven so catastrophically incompetent. The seeds of rebellion were sown in the fertile ground of defeat and taxation. This internal dissent finally coalesced in 1440 with the formation of the Prussian Confederation. It was an alliance of 53 nobles and 19 cities who banded together to defend their rights and privileges against the Order's oppressive rule. Initially, they sought reform within the state, but the knights, proud and intransigent even in their weakness, refused to concede any of their power. The conflict festered for years, a cold war between the rulers and the ruled, until February of 1454, when the Confederation openly rebelled. They formally renounced their allegiance to the Grand Master and swore an oath of loyalty to the King of Poland, Casimir IV Jagiellon, asking him to incorporate Prussia into his kingdom. The king, eager to finally break the Order's power and gain control of the lucrative Prussian ports, agreed. This act triggered the 13 Years' War, a grueling, devastating conflict that was not a foreign invasion, but a civil war. It pitted the Teutonic Knights against their own subjects, their own cities, and their own nobility. It was a war for the very soul of Prussia. The 13 Years' War was a messy, brutal, and deeply dishonorable affair. The Order, its ranks of knight brothers severely depleted since Grunwald, could no longer field an army on its own. They were forced to rely on mercenaries, professional soldiers from Bohemia and Germany who fought not for God or glory, but for coin. The ideals of the Holy Crusade were now a distant, mocking memory. The white mantle with the black cross now flew alongside the banners of hired killers. The irony was bitter. The holy warriors, who had once been the most disciplined army in Europe, were now dependent on the notoriously unreliable and avaricious mercenary captains of the day. The war dragged on for over a decade, a series of sieges, skirmishes, and betrayals. Cities changed hands multiple times. The countryside was ravaged, not by a foreign enemy, but by the armies both sides had hired to fight for them. The state was tearing itself apart. The ultimate humiliation, the act that symbolized the complete moral and financial bankruptcy of the order, came in the year 1457. The mercenaries in the order's employ, who had not been paid for months, held the key to the war. They garrisoned the order's most important fortresses, including the mighty capital of Marienburg itself. With their wages massively in arrears, their commander, a Bohemian captain named Ulrich Cervenka, did the unthinkable. He entered into negotiations with the Poles. He offered to sell the castles he held, including Marienburg, to the Polish king in exchange for the back pay he was owed. The holy warriors had become bankrupts, their greatest strongholds now mere commodities to be bartered by mercenaries. The Polish king agreed to the price. In June of 1457, the gates of Marienburg, the unconquered symbol of Teutonic power, were opened not by force of arms, but by a mercenary's greed. King Casimir IV rode into the Grand Master's castle, not as a conqueror, but as a buyer. The order had lost its honor, its capital, and the war. The loss of Marienburg was the final blow. Although the war sputtered on for a few more years, the outcome was inevitable. The Second Peace of Thorn was signed in 1466, and its terms were devastating. The order was forced to cede the entire western half of its territory to Poland, including the fertile Vistula Delta, all the major trading cities like Danzig and Thorn, and even their former capital of Marienburg. This new Polish province would be known as Royal Prussia. What remained of the order's state, the eastern half, with its capital now moved to Königsberg, was allowed to survive, but only as a rump state, a shadow of its former self. And in the final, crushing humiliation, the Grand Master was forced to become a vassal of the Polish king. He had to swear an oath of fealty to the son of the man who had destroyed his army at Grunwald. The sovereign state, the great Ordensstaat, built on the bones of the Prussians, was no more. The Teutonic Knights were now merely tenants in a diminished land, subject to the authority of their oldest and most hated enemy. The great crusading enterprise had ended in vassalage. Was this the judgment of God, or simply the inevitable price of arrogance? Perhaps they were one and the same. The descent from holy warriors to humiliated vassals was complete. Now only the final act of betrayal remained. What do you think is the ultimate sin? Losing a holy war or betraying everything you once fought for to survive? Let us know in the comments if you stand with the last crusader or the first survivor. The century following the disastrous 13 Years' War was a period of slow, inexorable decline for the Teutonic Order in Prussia. They were a shadow of their former selves, ruling a diminished territory as vassals of the Polish crown. The Grand Masters were often chosen for their political connections to the great families of the Holy Roman Empire, in the hope that they could leverage imperial power to somehow reverse their fortunes and throw off the Polish yoke. This policy led to a series of simmering conflicts and one last, futile war against Poland from 1519 to 1521, which ended in another defeat for the order. They were trapped, a relic of a bygone era, clinging to the symbols of a holy war that no one in Europe, apart from themselves, still believed in. The world around them was changing in ways they could not comprehend. A storm was gathering in the heart of Germany, an intellectual and spiritual revolution that would shatter the unity of Christendom and, in doing so, deliver the final fatal blow to the crusading state. The enemy was no longer a pagan warrior or a Polish knight. It was an idea, and it was an idea that would be wielded by their own Grand Master in the ultimate act of betrayal. In the year 1511, a young nobleman from a minor branch of the powerful Hohenzollern dynasty was elected Grand Master. His name was Albert. He was ambitious, intelligent, and unlike his predecessors, a pragmatist who understood that the Order's military path was a dead end. He spent his early years as Grand Master engaged in the usual fruitless political maneuvering, trying to escape his vassalage to Poland. But then he heard of the teachings of a rebellious Augustinian monk from Wittenberg named Martin Luther. Luther's message, that salvation came through faith alone, not through works or the sacraments of the Church, and that monastic orders had no scriptural basis, struck Europe like a thunderbolt. For most of the order, this was dangerous heresy. For Albert of Brandenburg, it was a lifeline. He saw in the Reformation not a spiritual threat, but a political opportunity of breathtaking cynicism and genius. It offered him a way to solve all of his problems at once: his vassalage to Poland, the internal decay of his monastic state, and his own personal ambition. Albert travelled to Wittenberg and met with Luther in person. The reformer gave him a piece of radical, revolutionary advice. He told Albert to abandon the absurd and inept rules of his order, to take a wife, and to convert the monastic state of the Teutonic Knights into a secular, hereditary duchy for himself and his family. In essence, Luther advised him to dissolve the very organization he had sworn a holy vow to lead, to betray a 300-year-old legacy, and to seize its assets as his own personal property. It was a temptation that Albert could not resist. He recognized that the age of the crusading knight was over. The future belonged to secular princes and national states. He could either go down with the sinking ship of the order, a forgotten grandmaster of a dying institution, or he could become a modern Protestant duke, the founder of a new dynasty. The choice, for a man like Albert, was simple. The vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience, the sacred mission of the Black Cross, it all meant nothing in the face of raw political power. The execution of his plan was swift and decisive. Albert returned to Prussia and in 1525 he openly converted to Lutheranism. He declared the Teutonic Order in Prussia dissolved. Its vast lands and immense wealth were secularized, transformed from the property of a religious order into the personal domain of Duke Albert. The Knight brothers were given a choice. They could either abandon their vows, convert to the new faith, and become landed nobles in the new duchy, or they could leave. Many, weary of the order's decline and attracted by the prospect of marriage and property, chose to follow their leader. Those who remained faithful to their Catholic vows were expelled, their commanderies seized. The theocratic military state, which had been born in the Holy Land and built through a century of brutal holy war, was dismantled not by an enemy army, but by its own commander-in-chief in a simple, administrative act. It was the greatest and most successful corporate raid in history, a hostile takeover from the inside. The final act of this grand betrayal took place in the main square of Krakow, the capital of his old enemy, Poland. On the 10th of April 1525, Albert of Brandenburg, the last Grand Master of the Teutonic Order in Prussia, knelt before the Polish king, Sigismund I. He was no longer dressed in the white mantle of a crusader, but in the fine robes of a secular prince. There, in a public ceremony of immense symbolic weight, he paid homage to the king, not as a vassal Grand Master, but as the first Duke of Prussia. He had traded his monk's cowl for a ducal coronet. In exchange for converting to Lutheranism and making Prussia a secular fief of the Polish crown, he was granted the right to pass the duchy on to his heirs. The Hohenzollern dynasty, which would one day unite Germany and forge an empire, had just been born from the carcass of the Teutonic Order. The long and bloody history of the crusading state in Prussia had come to an ignominious end, not with a bang, but with a legal document and a cynical handshake. What became of the order itself? The branches in the Holy Roman Empire, primarily in the German and Austrian lands, disowned Albert and his act of apostasy. They declared him a heretic and elected a new Grand Master to lead what was left of the organization. But they had lost their heartland, their primary territory and reason for being. The Teutonic Order was now a landlord without a state, a decapitated body that continued to twitch. It survived, but as a fundamentally different entity. It became an aristocratic Catholic organization, largely under the influence of the powerful Habsburg dynasty of Austria. Its members were no longer frontier warriors, but high-ranking nobles who held honorary positions and managed the order's extensive agricultural estates in Germany. The fire had gone out of them. The Black Cross, once a symbol of terror, and conquest on the Baltic frontier was now little more than a piece of heraldry, a nostalgic emblem of a glorious and bloody past. The knights still wore their white mantles on ceremonial occasions, and they still participated in wars, but not as a sovereign power. They served as officers in the armies of the Habsburg emperors, fighting a new infidel on a new frontier. Small contingents of Teutonic knights fought with distinction in the long and brutal wars against the Ottoman Empire in Hungary and the Balkans. They helped defend Vienna from the Turkish siege in 1683. They were brave soldiers, but they were no longer the masters of their own destiny. They were a military subsidiary of the Habsburg Empire, a living fossil from the age of Crusades, strangely out of place in the new world of gunpowder armies and nation-states. Their stories seemed to be drifting towards a quiet, unremarkable end, a slow fade into the footnotes of history. They were becoming ghosts, shadows of the empire they had lost. This ghostly existence continued for nearly 3 more centuries. The order became a comfortable and prestigious institution for the younger sons of the German Catholic nobility. It was a career path, a way to serve God and the emperor while living a comfortable life, administering the order's wealthy estates. The grand Gothic castles of Prussia were a distant memory. Their new headquarters were in pleasant towns in southern Germany, like Mergentheim. They were no longer feared, they were barely even remembered by the common people. The final blow to this phase of their existence came from a man who had his own dreams of empire, Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1809, as part of his reorganization of Germany, Napoleon formally dissolved the Teutonic Order in all the German states under his control and confiscated its properties. Once again, the order was stripped of its wealth and its lands. It survived only in the Austrian Empire, a tiny, protected remnant clinging to existence by the grace of the Habsburg Emperor. The once mighty conquerors of Prussia were now reduced to a single, small branch in Vienna. The order limped through the 19th century, a shadow of a shadow. It had lost its military function, its political power, and almost all of its wealth. In 1929, in the face of the collapse of the Austrian Empire and the new realities of the 20th century, Pope Pius XI radically reformed it once more. He abolished its knightly, aristocratic character and transformed it into a purely religious order of priests, nuns, and lay associates. Its new mission was to be entirely charitable, pastoral, and apostolic. The sword was finally laid down for good. The circle seemed to be complete. The organization that had begun as a humble hospital in the besieged city of Acre had, after 700 years of war, conquest, and political intrigue, finally returned to its original calling, charity and healing. It was a quiet, peaceful end to a violent story. But history was not finished with the Teutonic Knights. Their ghost, the dark and twisted memory of their conquests, was about to be resurrected and twisted into a symbol for the most monstrous regime the world had ever seen. The cursed legacy of the Black Cross was about to be given a terrifying new life. The rise of the Third Reich in Germany in the 20th century saw the deliberate and cynical hijacking of the Teutonic Order's history. For Adolf Hitler and the ideologues of the Nazi Party, the medieval knights were the perfect symbol for their own brutal ambitions. They saw the Order's eastward expansion, the Drang nach Osten, as a historical precedent for their own plans to conquer Eastern Europe and enslave its Slavic populations. The knights were reimagined as proto-Nazis, pure-blooded Aryan warriors who had brought German culture and civilization to the inferior races of the East by fire and sword. The Black Cross, the Balkenkreuz, was painted on the sides of Wehrmacht tanks and Luftwaffe planes as they rolled into Poland and the Soviet Union, a deliberate and chilling echo of the medieval crusade. The history of the order was twisted into a crude propaganda tool, a justification for genocide. The complex and often dishonorable story of the warrior monks was stripped of all nuance and transformed into a heroic myth of racial purity and manifest destiny. The knights, who had been dead for centuries, were conscripted into one last horrific campaign. This Nazi appropriation of their symbolism cast a long, dark shadow over the Order's legacy. After the Second World War, the very name Teutonic Knights was inextricably linked in the public imagination with the horrors of Nazism. The actual surviving Catholic religious order had to painstakingly distance itself from this monstrous caricature. They had to remind the world that they had been dissolved by Napoleon and had no connection to the Prussian state that eventually unified Germany, let alone the Third Reich. They had to emphasize their new, purely charitable mission. The irony was profound. The Nazis had celebrated the most brutal aspects of the Order's history, the conquest, the racial subjugation, the ruthless efficiency, while the real, living Order was trying to embody its most humble origins, caring for the sick and the poor. The Black Cross had become a symbol of two diametrically opposed ideas, selfless charity and genocidal hatred. And what of the Teutonic Order today? It still exists. It is officially called the Order of the Brethren of the German House of St. Mary in Jerusalem. Its headquarters are in Vienna next to St. Stephen's Cathedral. It is a small, quiet Roman Catholic religious order with a few dozen priests and nuns and several hundred lay associates. They run parishes, schools and hospitals in Austria, Germany, Italy, and a few other European countries. They are no longer knights, they do not fight wars, they do not rule a state, they heal the sick, they educate the young, and they care for the needy. The circle is, in a way, complete. The organization that began in a hospital tent in Acre has returned to the business of mercy. The sword has been beaten back into a scalpel. They have, at last, remembered how to heal. But can 700 years of blood be so easily washed away? The red brick castles they built still stand, scattered across Poland and the Kaliningrad Oblast of Russia. Marienburg, now Malbork, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a tourist attraction visited by millions who marvel at its Gothic grandeur, often unaware of the brutal reality of the state it once commanded. The legacy of the Order is a complex and troubling one. They were pioneers of statecraft and administration. They were also the perpetrators of what modern historians do not hesitate to call a genocide. They were devout men of God who committed unspeakable atrocities in His name. They were the builders of cities and the destroyers of cultures. They were a symbol of Western civilization and a harbinger of its most destructive impulses. They were holy assassins, corporate raiders in monks' robes, and architects of a totalitarian dream. Their story is a timeless and terrifying reminder that the line between a crusader and a conqueror, between a saint and a monster, is often perilously thin. It serves as a permanent warning that the most dangerous men are not those who believe in nothing, but those who believe in their own righteousness so absolutely that they are willing to burn the world to build their paradise. Today's order has returned to its original mission, mercy. They heal, they do not kill. But the shadows of the past are long. History has shown that any idea, even the noblest, can become a weapon. The question is, who wields it? Tell us, what do you believe defines the true face of the Order, its charitable birth or its bloody history? Write your answer in the comments, because the past is never silent.